The sun hung low over the dense Amazon rainforest, its golden light filtering through the thick canopy in scattered beams. The air was heavy with humidity, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the faint call of a howler monkey echoed, a mournful sound that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. The river, wide and dark, snaked through the forest, its surface smooth as glass, but hiding secrets beneath. A lone figure moved cautiously along the riverbank. Dr. Elena Marquez, a wildlife biologist, had been tracking the movements of a rare black caiman for weeks. Her boots sank into the soft mud with each step, and her khaki clothes clung to her skin in the oppressive heat. She carried a small backpack with her equipment, a GPS tracker, a notebook, and a camera. Her dark hair was tied back, but strands stuck to her forehead as she wiped away sweat. The forest was alive around her, but she felt an unease she couldn't shake. The black caiman was no ordinary predator. It was a relic of a bygone era, a creature that had survived the rise and fall of civilizations. At over 15 feet long, it was the apex predator of this stretch of the river, a silent hunter that ruled its domain with an ancient, primal intelligence. Alina had heard the stories from local guides, whispers of a caiman that seemed to stalk its prey with a cunning unlike any other. She had dismissed them as folklore, but now, as she ventured deeper into its territory, she wasn't so sure. The forest grew quieter as the sun dipped lower, the usual chorus of birds and insects fading into an eerie silence. Elena paused, her senses on high alert. She scanned the river, her eyes tracing the dark water for any sign of movement. The surface remained still, but she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as though she were being watched. She shook off the feeling and pressed on, determined to find the caiman's nesting site. The riverbank narrowed, forcing her to walk closer to the water's edge. The mud here was slick, and she had to tread carefully to avoid slipping. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the tension in her chest growing with each step. She glanced at her GPS, noting that she was nearing the coordinates where the caiman had last been spotted. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees leaning closer, their gnarled roots twisting like serpents in the dim light. A sudden splash broke the silence, and Elena froze. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the water. Nothing. Just ripples spreading across the surface, fading into stillness. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her nerves. It was probably just a fish, she told herself. But the unease lingered, a gnawing feeling that she was not alone. As she continued, the forest grew darker, the shadows deepening as the sun disappeared behind the trees. She switched on her headlamp, the beam cutting through the gloom. The light reflected off the water, creating an otherworldly glow. She paused again, listening. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as though holding its breath. Even the air felt heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. Then she saw it. A pair of glowing eyes just above the water's surface, staring at her from the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her boots sinking into the mud. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They simply watched her, unblinking and cold. The black caiman. It was closer than she had ever been to one, and the sheer size of it was overwhelming. Its massive head broke the surface, the water sliding off its armored scales like oil. It was a living fossil, a creature that belonged to a time when the world was wild and untamed. Elena's mind raced. She knew she should retreat, but her curiosity held her in place. She reached for her camera, her hands trembling as she adjusted the settings. The caiman remained still, its eyes locked on hers. She raised the camera, the click of the shutter breaking the silence. In that moment, the caiman moved. It surged forward with terrifying speed, its powerful tail propelling it through the water. Elena stumbled backward, her heart pounding as she turned and ran. The forest blurred around her, the trees and roots a chaotic maze. She could hear the caiman behind her, the sound of its body crashing through the water, the low rumble of its growl vibrating through the air. She didn't dare look back. Her boots slipped in the mud and she fell, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She scrambled to her feet, her hands clawing at the ground as she pushed herself up. The caiman was close now, its jaws snapping shut with a sound that sent a jolt of terror through her. She ran, her legs burning, her chest heaving. The riverbank curved ahead and she veered toward the trees, hoping to lose the predator in the dense undergrowth. But the caiman was relentless. It emerged from the water, its massive body moving with surprising agility on land. Elena's headlamp flickered, the beam casting erratic shadows as she ran. She could feel the caiman's presence behind her, the ground shaking with each step it took. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going. Then, just as she thought she couldn't run any farther, she saw it. A fallen tree, its trunk creating a natural bridge over a narrow ravine. Without thinking, she climbed onto the trunk, her hands gripping the rough bark as she balanced precariously. The caiman reached the base of the tree, its jaws snapping at the air as it tried to follow. Elena moved quickly, her heart in her throat as she crossed to the other side. She collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. The caiman let out a low growl, its eyes still fixed on her, but it didn't attempt to cross. It lingered for a moment, then turned and slipped back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. Elena lay there, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. The forest was silent once more, the tension slowly ebbing away. She stared at the river, the dark water now calm and still. The black caiman was gone, but she knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. As she gathered her things and began the long walk back to camp, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had intruded on something ancient and sacred. The black caiman's domain was not a place for humans. It was a world ruled by instinct and survival, where the line between predator and prey was razor thin. And as the forest closed in around her, she knew she would never forget the eyes that had stared into hers, cold and unyielding. A reminder of the wild's untamed power. The story of the black caiman would stay with her, not as a tale of fear, but as a testament to the raw, primal beauty of the natural world. And though she would never venture so close again, she knew that the caiman's domain would remain, a place where the ancient and the modern collided, and where the wild still reigned supreme. Elena's journey back to camp was a blur. The forest, once alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. Her headlamp flickered weakly, its beam barely piercing the darkness. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of underbrush, made her flinch. Her mind replayed the caiman's attack, the way its eyes had locked onto hers, the sheer power of its movement. She had always respected the wild, but now she felt its weight pressing down on her, a reminder of how small and fragile she was in its presence. When she finally reached camp, the sight of her tent and the faint glow of her lantern brought a fleeting sense of relief. She dropped her backpack and sank onto a log, her hands trembling as she reached for her water bottle. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her drained and shaken. She stared into the fire she had lit earlier, its flames dancing in the night, and tried to steady her breathing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the caiman's glowing eyes, felt the ground tremble beneath its weight. The forest outside her tent was alive with sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But they no longer felt comforting. They felt like warnings, like the forest itself was watching her. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of rain. It fell softly at first, pattering against the canvas of her tent, but soon grew into a steady downpour. She packed up her camp quickly, eager to leave the river behind. As she hiked back toward the research station, the rain soaked through her clothes, coaling her skin, but doing little to ease the tension in her chest. When she arrived at the station, her colleagues were quick to notice her disheveled state. They asked questions, but she brushed them off with vague answers. She wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, not yet. Instead, she buried herself in her work, reviewing the data she had collected and uploading the photos from her camera. But when she opened the folder containing the images from the previous day, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the black caiman, its massive head breaking the surface of the water, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The photo was sharp, perfectly focused, capturing every detail of the creature's armored scales and powerful jaws. But what struck her most was the expression in its eyes. It wasn't the mindless gaze of a predator. It was calculating, almost intelligent, as though it had known she was there all along. Elena stared at the photo for a long time, her mind racing. She had always believed that animals acted on instinct, that their behavior was driven by survival and nothing more. But this caiman, it had seemed almost deliberate in its actions, as though it had been toying with her. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Over the next few days, Elena found herself drawn back to the river. She told herself it was for research, that she needed to gather more data on the caiman's behavior. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The encounter had left her with a gnawing curiosity, a need to understand the creature that had come so close to ending her life. She returned to the riverbank, this time with a team of researchers and better equipment. They set up cameras and motion sensors, hoping to capture footage of the caiman without putting themselves in danger. But the creature was elusive. Days passed without a single sighting, and Elena began to wonder if it had moved on. Then, one night, the sensors triggered. Elena and her team rushed to the monitors, their excitement palpable. The footage showed the caiman emerging from the water, its massive body moving with a grace that belied its size. It paused at the edge of the riverbank, its head turning slowly as though scanning the area. Then, to their astonishment, it looked directly into the camera. The room fell silent as they watched the footage. The caiman's gaze was piercing, its eyes seeming to bore into theirs even through the screen. It lingered for a moment, then turned and slipped back into the water, disappearing into the darkness. Elena felt a mix of awe and unease. The caiman's behavior was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't just a predator. It was a creature of intelligence and awareness, a being that understood its environment in ways she couldn't comprehend. As the weeks went by, the team continued to monitor the caiman, but it remained elusive. It seemed to know where the cameras were, always avoiding them with an almost deliberate precision. Elena began to wonder if they were the ones being studied, if the caiman was watching them just as closely as they were watching it. The thought stayed with her long after she left the rainforest. She returned to the city, to her life of lectures and research papers, but the memory of the black caiman lingered. It was a reminder of the mysteries that still existed in the world, of the wild places where ancient creatures roamed, untouched by human understanding. And sometimes, late at night, she would dream of the river. She would see the caiman's eyes glowing in the darkness, watching her with a gaze that was both ancient and knowing. In those moments, she felt a connection to something greater than herself, something primal and eternal. The black caiman's domain was not a place for humans. It was a world ruled by instinct and survival, where the line between predator and prey was razor thin. And though Elena would never return, she knew that the caiman was still out there, a silent guardian of the wild, a reminder of the untamed power of the natural world. Years passed, and Elena's encounter with the black caiman became a story she rarely told. It was not out of fear, but out of reverence. The experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She continued her work as a wildlife biologist, but her focus shifted. She became an advocate for the preservation of untouched wilderness, a voice for the creatures that lived in the shadows of human progress. The black caiman had become a symbol for her, a reminder of the wild's enduring mystery and the importance of leaving some places untouched. Yet, despite her efforts to move on, the caiman never truly left her thoughts. It haunted her dreams and lingered in the back of her mind, a presence as real as the rainforest itself. She often found herself wondering if it was still out there, patrolling its domain with the same ancient vigilance. One day, a letter arrived at her office. It was from a young researcher named Mateo, who was working in the same region of the Amazon where Elena had encountered the caiman. He had read her published work and was reaching out for advice. His team had been tracking a large black caiman, one that seemed to exhibit unusual behavior. It was larger than any they had seen before, and it appeared to be avoiding their cameras and traps with an almost deliberate cunning. Mateo had attached a photo, a grainy, nighttime shot of the caiman emerging from the water, its eyes glowing like twin moons. Elena's heart raced as she studied the image. It was unmistakably the same caiman. The size, the shape of its head, the way it carried itself, it was as if no time had passed at all. She felt a strange mix of emotions, excitement, trepidation, and a deep, almost primal curiosity. She knew she had to see it again. After weeks of preparation, Elena found herself back in the Amazon. The forest was as dense and alive as she remembered, the air thick with the scent of earth and vegetation. Mateo met her at the research station, a young man with a nervous energy and a passion for his work. He briefed her on their findings, showing her maps of the caiman's movements and footage of its elusive behavior. Elena listened intently, her mind racing with possibilities. The team set out at dawn, following the riverbank to the area where the caiman had last been spotted. The forest was alive with sound, the chatter of monkeys, the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as they approached the river, the sounds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Elena felt the familiar prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the same unease she had felt years ago. They set up their equipment, carefully positioning cameras and motion sensors along the riverbank. Elena stayed behind while the rest of the team returned to the station. Her insistence on solitude met with reluctant acceptance. She knew the caiman would not reveal itself if it sensed a crowd. She needed to be alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker, the shadows deepening into an inky blackness. Elena sat on a fallen log, her senses heightened, every sound amplified in the stillness. The river flowed silently before her, its surface reflecting the faint light of the moon. She waited, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The forest remained silent, the river still. Elena began to wonder if she had made a mistake, if the caiman had moved on or simply chosen to remain hidden. But just as she was about to give up, she heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes scanning the water. At first, she saw nothing. Then, slowly, the surface of the river began to ripple. A dark shape emerged, its massive head breaking the water with a quiet grace. The caiman. It was larger than she remembered, its scales glistening in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with the same cold intelligence, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Elena remained perfectly still, her heart pounding as the caiman approached the riverbank. It moved with a deliberate slowness, its massive body gliding through the water like a shadow.